So 2 weeks ago, we talked about the land. Do you remember when we talked about that? I showed you some maps and we talked about the land. What I wanted you to get was the gist that God had obviously promised the Israelites land, and there's debate over whether or not they got it. Technically, you can make the case they got it during Solomon and David's reign. There were some vassal states and stuff, and he controlled it, but it wasn't technically part of, I guess you could say, maybe national or Israel. It was just run by them. And so there's debate on whether or not they actually got the land or they didn't. Okay? Why is that important? Why does it matter if they got the land or they didn't get the land?
Because God promised.
Because God promised they would get the land. Yeah, that's a big one. What does it have to do for people kind of looking at end times views? If you think they got the land, it can change what you think about the end times. Did you know that? Because some people say the land's been done, there's no more issue with that. There's a group of Christian beliefs out there that say, doesn't matter. But if they didn't get the land, what are some Christians going to say? It's still a promise that's outstanding that hasn't been fulfilled, and so what's going to happen? They got to get the land. And this is where you see a divide in the Christian community, because some will say they already got it, and some will say they haven't got it yet. And it entirely affects your end times view. 100% impacts your end times view. So that's why we're spending time on this, because if you watch any of the prophecy people on TV or Facebook, or you click any of that stuff, you're going to find out pretty quickly which camp they're in based on where they go. And it all comes down to this question of, what do I do with Israel? What do I do with these promises to Israel? So that's why we're going to walk through these. So we're going to actually even go slower today, and we're going to talk about the verses, and I'm going to ask you some questions that you're going to have to make some decisions on, and then we'll kind of see where they go from there, okay? So that's where we're going to go today. So here's what we're going to talk about. I'm calling this the land part 2. The land, the covenants, and the exile, okay? We're going to spend more time on the covenants than anything, because we did already talk about the land a little bit, and the exile will be coming. But I want to get you really thinking about these covenants, okay? So first question is, what's a covenant? We hear it, but what is it? Contract, okay? So when we talk about the New Testament and the Old Testament, you could just change the word testament to covenant or contract. That's what that means. The old contract, the new contract, okay? The new covenant, the old covenant. So we're going to talk a lot about that today, and you're really going to have to, like I said, you have to put your thinking caps on. I used to say that when I was in school. Put your thinking caps on. You're going to have to put those on today, because you're going to really have to go through some text with me verse by verse and make some decisions. And I'm really curious of what your takeaway is, okay? So I think we're going to have some fun with some of these. So we'll start here. So let's talk about the Abrahamic covenant and the land. It's kind of, to kick it off, it's kind of in the name. The covenant is with who? Abraham. So this is that first covenant with Abraham, and it has to do with the land, okay? It has to do with what they're going to get. So let's look at a verse here in Genesis 12. Here's what it says. Yahweh said to Abram, this was before they even changed his name, so it's real early. Go out from your land and from your relatives and from the house of your father to the land that I will show you, and I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and those who curse you I will curse, and all the families of the earth will be blessed in you. You've probably heard this one a time or two, right? So what is he telling him? I'm going to make you a great nation. It's going to actually impact all the nations of the earth. And this is what I want you to do. And what did he tell him? You got to leave home, right? Be ready to go to the land that I'm going to give you. So here's Genesis 15, just a couple chapters later. Abraham said, look, you have not given me a descendant, and here a member of my household is my heir. Abraham didn't have any kids. Abram had no kids at this point, remember? And he's going, well, how are you going to make me a great nation when I don't have any descendants? And since he didn't have any kids, they would just take a very esteemed member, and what would they do? They'd say, if something happens, you inherit it all. It's not your blood lineage, though, and that was a big deal, right? It's a big deal. He says, and behold, the word of Yahweh came to him, saying, this person will not be your heir, but your own son will be your heir. And he brought him outside, and he said, look toward the heavens and count the stars, if you are able to count them. And he said to him, so shall your offspring be. And he believed in Yahweh, and he reckoned it to him as righteousness. That's that classic verse, right? He believed him, and then it was righteousness was given to him. And he said to him, I am Yahweh who brought you out from Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to you to possess it. And he said, "O Yahweh God, how shall I know that I will possess it?" Right? So God makes a promise to him, takes him outside, does the demonstration. And then do you like Abram's request at his question at the very end? How am I going to know that this is legitimately a promise? And then this kicks off the whole scene we talked about a couple weeks ago where he says, get all the animals and chop them up, and then God passes through them. It's an ancient contract that they make. Okay. Here's Genesis 15, 17 through 18. And after the sun had gone down and it was dusk, behold, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passed between those half pieces. And on that day Yahweh made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your offspring I will give this land from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, or the Euphrates River. Okay? This is what we talked about a couple weeks ago. It's kind of a little bit of a recap. But did that happen? This is the argument that's made. Well, maybe under Solomon and David, because they technically did have the river of Egypt, which this is not the Nile. This is a different river that's towards the delta. Okay? Nile had a different word. All the way to the Euphrates. And so there is an argument to be made that you could say, yes, they got it. That this was done. Okay? Doesn't mean that it's not going to happen in the future, like God's going to say, that's it, it's over. But there are people who will think that. God was good on his promise. Okay? So here's the question. Based on those verses we just read, is God's promise of the land and the great nation to Abraham conditional or unconditional? Unconditional. Why? Why is it unconditional? God's the only one who went through the pieces of animals and passed through. Okay? I want you to keep that in mind. Okay? Because it seems pretty cut and dry, doesn't it? God made an unconditional contract. So if you say unconditional, which I think is what we got as kind of the consensus, that means that God will do what he said regardless of what Abraham does. Agreed? Okay. If a person said conditional, then that would mean Abraham was still required to do certain things or else. Now it sounds like we kind of land in our group in the first one. Unconditional. That means Abraham, doesn't matter what he does, the contract, the promise to him will be kept. So let's look at that a little bit. Here's Genesis 17. We're not too far away, but we're a little further on. When Abram was 99 years old, Yahweh appeared to Abram, and he said to him, I am El Shaddai, walk before me and be blameless, so that I may make my covenant between me and you and may multiply you exceedingly. What's he telling him here? Either walk before me and be blameless, and if you do that, what does he say? So that I will make my covenant between me and you. Now, how do you take this verse and the last verse and put them together and make it all say the same thing? And here's the reason that's tough, is because it's like, well, I thought we already crossed this bridge, God. Like, a few chapters ago, you just said these things. You passed the fire pot incident. We had all that. And now we're 2 chapters later. Abram's older. Yahweh shows up and he says, hey, Abram, you need to walk before me and be blameless so that I can make my covenant with you. Okay, you still with me? Just want you thinking about this verse a little bit. Is this statement with condition or is it unconditional? It sounds like he's saying you need to walk before me and be blameless so that I can make my covenant with you. Well, that sounds like a tall task. Especially when guys like Paul will say, there is no one righteous, there's no one blameless. Everybody's got sin. And what does he want Abram to do? I want you to walk before me in righteousness, do what's right always. And if you do these things, I'm going to make my covenant with you. So you could say this is where it kind of almost falls into this state of a unconditional, conditional contract. That's a legitimate term that is discussed in scholarly Christianity. Because it looks like God is saying, I'm the only one who's doing this. Like, it's just me. All you have to do is just be. But yet, now he comes back. He says, hey, by the way, 2 chapters later, Abram, I know you're a little older, but you need to do what's right so I can make my covenant with you. Okay, now we're not done yet. It's going to get more complicated. So put your thinking caps back on, okay? What does God mean by walk before me blameless? That would be an important one if God's about to say, hey, you have to do X and I'll make my contract with you. Like, okay, what do you mean? What do I have to do? Well, walk before me and be blameless. Oh boy. Doesn't sound like I can do that one, you know. Genesis 17 again, 3 through 8. Abram fell upon his face, and God spoke with him, saying, as for me, behold, my covenant shall be with you, and you shall be the father of a multitude of nations. Okay, we're back to the original thing now. It sounds like the promise. Your name shall no longer be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham, for I will make you the father of a multitude of nations, and I will make you exceedingly fruitful. I will make you a nation, and kings shall go out from you. Okay. Conditional, unconditional. Sure sounds like an unconditional statement. Here's what I'm going to do. Let's go on. He says, and I will establish my covenant between me and you and between your offspring after you throughout their generations as an everlasting covenant to be as God for you and to your offspring after you. And I will give to you and to your offspring after you the land in which you are living as an alien, all the land of Canaan as an everlasting property, and I will be to them as God. Well, that sounds pretty... You're like, hey, you just, I'm making my contract with you and it's yours forever. Doesn't it?
Yeah. Pretty straightforward.
Yeah, sounds like it. Now, what does God mean by offspring? He says, I'm going to give to you your offspring after you, the land in which you're living. Here's Genesis 16. The angel of Yahweh found her. Who's her here in this one? There was a little situation that Abraham ran into. He didn't have a son, and so what does his wife decide? Well, I've got this maidservant, Hagar, and since I can't have kids, she can. And so you've heard the story, Ishmael's born. So here's where we find him. The angel of Yahweh found her, this is Hagar, at a spring of water in the wilderness at the spring by the road of Shur. And he said to Hagar, the female slave of Sarah, this is Sarai before her name was changed, from where have you come and where are you going? And she said, I'm fleeing from the presence of Sarai, my mistress. Then the angel of Yahweh said to her, return to your mistress and submit yourself under her authority. And the angel of Yahweh said to her, I will greatly multiply your offspring, so they cannot be counted for their abundance. And the angel of Yahweh said to her, and goes on to say, behold, you are pregnant and shall have a son, and you shall call his name Ishmael, for Yahweh has listened to your suffering. And he shall be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and the hand of everyone will be against him, and he will live in hostility with all his brothers. So my question goes back to the previous slide. What do you mean by offspring? When God says your offspring, what does he mean? Because who does Abraham have as his offspring? You could say, well, all the people of Israel. I mean, he had all these things. But right here, right off the bat, explain who his offspring are. Ishmael's the only one alive at this point. Would you qualify him as offspring? Is because from a literal sense, is Ishmael technically offspring from Abraham? He is, technically.
Not with him and his wife.
But not the pure one
Yeah.
through Sarah, right? But he's technically still offspring. He's just not offspring from Sarah and Abraham. Okay? I'm just trying to get you thinking here, okay, as we walk into this. I want you to really be able to break these things down. Abraham produced one child from his own body named Ishmael. It just wasn't with his wife Sarah, the legitimate wife. It was with the maidservant. Okay? We're not done yet, so stick with me, okay? That's not where the story ends, obviously. But I'm trying to get you to think literal blood, and what else does God mean by offspring? Okay, because we're going to look at a verse here. You're going to be like, okay, wait a second. I got to get in God's head here and figure out what he means. Okay, so let's go on a little bit. Okay, Genesis 21. The child grew and was weaned. Now it's Abraham. And Abraham made a great feast on the day Isaac was weaned. So now what's happened? The promise actually came true. Sarah's going to have a baby. She laughed about it. But hey, here's Isaac. Now he's old enough. He's being weaned. Okay, and here's where we are. And Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne Abraham, mocking. Then she said to Abraham, drive out this slave woman and her son, for the son of this slave woman will not be heir with my son, with Isaac. And the matter displeased Abraham very much on account of his son. Then God said to Abraham, do not be displeased on account of the boy and on account of the slave woman. Listen to everything that Sarah said to you, for through Isaac your offspring will be named, and I will also make the son of the slave woman into a nation, for he is your offspring. Okay, things are gotten real messy. See what happens when Abraham diverts? Now, could you make the case and say, Abraham, your instruction was, walk before me and be blameless. I would say this was probably not a blameless move. You took, God said he's going to do it, you took it into your own hands, and you produced a child that was not the one God was planning, but God knew what was going to happen here. But it's still your son. And based on this, Sarah's saying, we got a problem here. There's going to be an issue. You need to get the slave woman and her kid out of here because they're not going to compete with Isaac. And how does Abraham take that? Sure. It actually says he was upset by that. He did not like this idea. And I think Abraham's probably a good guy. I mean, it's his son. It may not be her son, but it's his son. And God ends up having to tell him, like, hey, don't worry about this. I'm going to take care of it. Okay? Don't worry about it. Let's go on. Genesis 22. And it happened after these things, God tested Abraham. Oh boy, here we go. And he said to him, Abraham, and he said, here I am. And he said, take your son. Uh-oh, we got a statement here. Your only child. Is that true? He doesn't have his own, this isn't his only child, but who's he? He's talking about the line, right? The line that was supposed to be of the promise. And so there's something physical here. You've got Ishmael from Abraham, you've got Isaac from Abraham, but yet God is looking at this a little differently. And he's saying, I want you to take your son, your only child, the one from your wife, Sarah, and whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains where I will tell you. But I want to focus on the contract with Abraham here, because we're trying to figure out, like, what's the promise here? Like, what does God owe you, if anything? What is God going to do for you, if anything? And what did you do to either keep it or did you blow it? Okay, so let's go on a little bit. And the angel of Yahweh called to Abram a second time from heaven. Here's Genesis 22. Okay, now look where we were at the beginning of chapter 22, the sacrifice of Isaac. Okay, now we're fast forwarding. We're in verse 15. This is after the event. Okay, and the angel of Yahweh called to Abram a second time from heaven. He said, I swear by myself, declares Yahweh, that because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, he says it again, your only child, that I will certainly bless you and greatly multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is by the shore of the sea. And your offspring will take possession of the gate of his enemies. All the nations of the earth will be blessed through your offspring because you have listened to my voice. This sounds back like Genesis 12. All the nations will be blessed. But what's weird is, he says, because you didn't withhold your son, I'm going to do these things. Conditional or unconditional? You just said, like, you're going to bless me and make me great, but then you put me through this test, and I go through flying colors, thankfully, and he says, oh, by the way, because you did this, I'm going to do this. So does Abraham have anything to do with this contract? Now we're going back a little bit. Genesis 17, I want you to remember this verse. God said to Abraham, now as for you, you must keep my covenant, you and your offspring after you, throughout their generations. This is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you, and also with your offspring after you. And then what does he say? Every male among you shall be circumcised. Okay, so we just went back in time a little bit. This is before the Isaac-Ishmael thing. And God said, I made a covenant with you, I made a contract with you. Now here's what you're going to do to basically, your part of the contract is what? All the males have to be circumcised, all of them. That's the sign of the covenant, and it has to be done. Does God take that seriously? How important is that element, that action that Abraham had to take with his descendants, all the male descendants? It could be a problem if you disobeyed. In fact, here's an example of it, okay? I'm going to show you. This is an obscure section in Exodus. On the way, the place overnight lodging, Yahweh encountered him, it's Moses, and he sought to kill him. Now that's not a position you want to be in with God, is it? But Zipporah took a flint knife and she cut off the foreskin of her son and she touched his feet and she said, "Yes, you are a bridegroom of blood to me." And he left him alone. At that time she said, "A bridegroom of blood," because of the circumcision. What in the world is going on here? Moses had not circumcised his son. This is he's about to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. Like, this is the leader of Israel. And God apparently runs into him in an inn and says, "I've had it with you. You're done." And it's his wife who actually finishes the procedure quickly to say, "Oh, we know what we should have done here. We didn't do it. For whatever reason, we got to get this done or God's going to off you, Moses. You're done," right? And so she does it. She circumcises. Yeah. Like, oh boy. Okay. Here's a commentary that I've used. It's like the name of this one. Commentary, critical, and explanatory of the whole Bible. How would you like to write that one, right? It's a good one. Here's what he wrote. The narrative is obscure, but the meaning seems to be that, led during his illness to a strict self-examination. What was his illness? Remember the whole, put your hand in? Yeah, I'm not a good talker, and God has all this, I'm going to give you leprosy on your hand and then take it away. Apparently, he's evaluating himself after this, is what this commentator is thinking. He was deeply pained and grieved at the thought of having to please his wife, postponed or neglected the circumcision of one of his sons, probably the younger. To dishonor that sign and seal of the covenant was criminal in any Hebrew, peculiarly so in one destined to be the leader and deliverer of the Hebrews. How important was circumcision to the covenant? Pretty important. You're literally about to kill Moses at a Best Western because of, he didn't obey. God takes this serious. You have one job to perform. So just a quick recap, make sure we're on the same page. God made a covenant with Abraham. We all agree with that, right? That's what we call the Abrahamic covenant, okay? The covenant required Abraham to be circumcised. Would you agree with that? I mean, I don't think it was any different for Abraham than Moses, because he would have offed Moses pretty quickly. Walk blameless. You define that, how you think God would define it before God. And God did not tolerate disobedience. Are those all fair statements?
Yes.
Okay. Moses almost was killed because of that. So here's decision time for you now. Okay? Is the Abrahamic covenant conditional or unconditional? It can look like both, and maybe it is both. So if Abraham doesn't do something, what happens? If Abraham says, I've given up, we're not doing circumcision, I'm not sacrificing my son Isaac on an altar, does God say, okay, doesn't matter,
No.
You still get the land anyway?
No, he says you're toast.
You're toast. So is it conditional or unconditional? And so that's why when I say it's kind of a rhetorical question, I'm not saying it so that you'll be like, yes, let's make our cases. Because you could go read and you can make cases for both. Or you can make cases that it is both. Either one or both. You have to make a decision here. Because if you make a certain decision, it's going to affect how you think about the end times. 100%. It's going to affect your eschatology or your end times views. Because if you think there's still something to be done, that God has some obligation under the contract, because it was unconditional, and it hasn't been squandered, it hasn't been fulfilled, then God still has things to do, which is to do what with Israel? Give them the land. And keep that land for them. But if you take the position that, no, it was done during David and Solomon, and in fact, some would argue that they squandered it. The exile is the reason. God said the land will be barren, it's over. And if you hold to that position, you don't think the land matters anymore. And this is Christianity. And I know we may be in a majority in our church thinking one way, but as an entire Big C church Christianity, it's very diverse in these two views. Isn't it interesting? And I'm telling you this not to get you to change your belief system, but so you know when you run into other Christians and Israel comes up, because that's why we're doing America's Issues, If this comes up and you have a conversation, they go, I don't think it matters. I don't think it matters. You go, well, these people are heretics. These people are anti-Bible. Actually, no. They just are trying to come to a conclusion based on the text, and they may have come there a little differently. Like when God makes a promise, if it's not 100% take it to the bank, cash that check all day, any day, for all of time, that's a dangerous place to live in. So see how we could say conditional, unconditional? I think it's an unconditional, conditional contract. Because I don't think God undoes his promises, ever. You have to be able to take him to the bank. But I do think that it might look a little different at the end than you thought it was at the beginning. And that can depend on the human being. But the contract, the promise doesn't change. And I'll show you that in just a second. Could God complete the ultimate plan regardless of Abraham's actions?
Yes.
So that sounds like it doesn't matter what Abraham does. Because God's going to do what he's going to do. It's his plan. If he wants his people in this place at this time from this lineage, there's nothing anybody can do to stop that. Let's look at this one. The Mosaic covenant in the land. Okay, I'm going to go another level. Okay, we looked at the Abrahamic. Let's go to Moses now. So what's the contract? So after we fast forward, boom, boom, boom. Okay, they're in Egypt for 400 years, and they get out, and Moses takes them to Sinai, and now they're at Sinai. Okay? God gives a written contract written in stone. What is this? The law, the Ten Commandments. Okay? Here's Deuteronomy 11. And you must keep all the commandments that I am commanding you today so that you may have strength, and you may go and you may take possession of the land to which you are crossing to take possession of it, so that you may live long on the land that Yahweh swore to your ancestors to give it to them and to their offspring, a land flowing with milk and honey. Okay, that sounds like similar language to Abraham, right? I'm going to give it to your descendants and so on, land flowing with milk and honey and so on. What does he say here? You must keep all the commandments that I'm giving you today, new contract, so that you can go in and do this thing that I promised to your ancestors. Conditional, unconditional. Deuteronomy 11:18. And you shall put these, my words, on your heart and on your inner self, and you shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and let them be as an emblem between your eyes. And you shall teach them to your children by talking about them when you sit in your house, and when you travel on the road, when you lie down and when you get up. And you shall write them on the doorframes of your house and on your gates, so that they may multiply your days and the days of your children on the land that Yahweh swore to your ancestors to give it to them as long as heaven endures over the earth. Sounds like you need to follow this, teach it to your kids, walk in the ways, right? Let's go on. Yes, if you diligently keep all these commandments that I am commanding you to observe it, but by loving Yahweh your God, by walking in all his ways, and by holding fast to him, then Yahweh will drive out all these nations before you, and you will dispossess nations larger and more numerous than you. Every place on which the sole of your foot treads shall be yours. Your boundary shall be from the desert and Lebanon, from the river Euphrates, on up to the western sea. No one can take a stand against you. Your dread and your fear, Yahweh your God will put on the surface of all the land where you tread, just as he promised you. He actually gives the parameters again. And he says, if you diligently keep these commandments, this is what's going to happen. Okay? Let's go on. See, I'm setting before you today a blessing and a curse. Now let's stop there. Genesis 12 says, I bless those who bless those, I curse those who curse you. And yet here in Deuteronomy, he's looking at the Israelites, and what is he saying?
A blessing and a curse.
You get to decide. A blessing or a curse? What do you want? And he says, the blessing, if you listen to the commandments of Yahweh your God that I am commanding you today. And the curse, if you do not listen to the commandments of Yahweh your God, but rather you turn from the way that I am commanding you today to go after other gods that you have not known. So you get to decide. What do you guys want? You want the blessing? Which I told you, I'll put you in the land, your descendants will take it, you'll have it forever. Or you can pick the curse by going after other gods. You can decide today. Let's go on. And it will happen that when Yahweh your God has brought you to the land that you are going to take possession of it, then you shall pronounce the blessing on Mount Gerizim and the curse on Mount Ebal. They would get on these two mountains and they would actually speak these promises or these blessing and curses. Okay? Are they not beyond the Jordan toward the west to the land of the Canaanites living in the Jordan Valley opposite Gilgal beside the Terebinth of Moreh? For you are now about to cross the Jordan to go to take possession of the land that Yahweh your God is giving to you, and you will take possession of it and live in it, and you must diligently observe all the rules and the regulations that I am setting before you today. It's a really important verse. Why? You notice he talks about these places where they did these cursings and the blessings on these mountains? And you notice he says in parentheses here, aren't they in this place? And then he says, besides the Terebinth of Moreh. Why is that important? What was it, the Terebinth of Moreh? I'll show you. When they came to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land of a place called Shechem to the oak of Moreh.
Uh-oh.
Now we're back to the Abrahamic covenant. And at that time the Canaanites were in the land, and the Lord appeared to Abram, and what does he say to him? To your offspring I will give this land. Okay. We had the Abrahamic covenant. Now we got Egypt stuff done, Sinai, and they're going into the land, and he says, I want you to get on these mountains, and it's not by accident I picked these two places. It has to do exactly back to the Abrahamic contract.
Right.
You want the land, this is what you're going to have to do. And he says, pick. Do you want a blessing? You want a curse? Which one do you want? Conditional? Unconditional. Exodus 23, little by little, I will drive them out before you until you are fruitful and take possession of the land. I will set your boundary from the Red Sea and up to the sea of the Philistines and from the desert up to the river, because I will give the inhabitants of the land into your hand, and you will drive them out from before you. You will not make a covenant with them and with their gods. They will not live in your land unless they cause you to sin against me when you serve their gods, for it will be a snare to you. Okay? Got it? Leviticus 26, now we're in law. If you walk in my statutes and you keep my commands, and if you do them, then I will give you rains in their time, and the land shall give its produce, and the trees of the field shall give their fruit. And for you the threshing season shall overtake the grape harvest, and the grape harvest shall overtake the sowing, and you shall eat your food till your fill, and you shall live securely in your land. More promises, right? Notice all these if you walk, if you obey. He goes on and says, I will turn to you, and I will make you fruitful, and I will make you numerous, and I will keep my covenant with you. Wait a second. I thought you were going to do that no matter what. And you shall eat old grain, and you shall clear away the old before the new, and I will put my dwelling place in your midst, and my inner self shall not abhor you, and I will walk about in your midst, and I shall be your God, and you shall be my people. You've heard that one before, right? Now I want you to keep that one in mind for a second. But if you do not listen to me, and you do not carry out all these commands, and if you reject my statutes, and if your inner self abhors my regulations, to not carry out all my commands by your breaking my covenant, I in turn will do this to you. And this is, I'm not even going to go through the whole thing. I'm just going to give you a quick little list, okay? Sickness and disease, defeat by enemies, wild animals will come in, take things out. There'll be famine, devastation of the land at the hand of God, and the people will be scattered throughout the nations. Yikes. Conditional, unconditional. So what happened? They did exactly what God said not to do, didn't they?
Yep.
Exiled, and all of these things happened. All of these things happened. So people will say, see, it was a conditional contract for the nation of Israel. They squandered it, and God did exactly what he said. It's over. And then another group will come in and say, yeah, I can see that, but he's not done yet. Conditional, unconditional. We're not done yet either, okay? Let's go on. But when they confess their guilt, okay, here's the big but if, but when. They confess their guilt and the guilt of their ancestors in their infidelity that they displayed against me, and moreover that they went against me in hostility. I myself also went against them in hostility, and I brought them into the land of their enemies. Or if then their uncircumcised heart is humbled, and then they pay for their guilt, I will remember my covenant with Jacob, and I will remember also my covenant with Isaac, and also my covenant with Abraham, and I will remember the land. So, when this happens, I'll put them back. I'll give everything back. Let's go on. And in spite of this, when they are in the land of their enemies, I will not reject them, and I will not abhor them to destroy them, to break my covenant with them, because I am Yahweh their God. And I will remember the first covenant for them, whom I brought out from the land of Egypt in the sight of the nations to be their God. I am Yahweh. Now, decision time again. Is Leviticus 26 conditional or unconditional? Have the Israelites returned to God through confession and repentance or not? This is the debate. Some would sit here and say, no, they haven't. Nationally, they have not. Let me show you this. Remember Leviticus, this one? We just looked at this a second ago. I will turn to you, and I will make you fruitful, and I will make you numerous. I will keep my commandment with you. You should eat the old grain. And he goes on down, and he says this famous phrase, and I will put my dwelling place in your midst, and my inner self shall not abhor you. And I will walk about in your midst, and I shall be your God, and you shall be my people. Was this fulfilled after the Mosaic covenant?
No.
Now I want you to think about this, okay? Did they get to the land through Moses, Joshua? Did they actually make it there?
Yeah.
Yes, they made it there. And then when they got there, what did they do under David and Solomon?
They built the temple.
They built a temple. How important is that?
Very.
Because, is that not this?
Yes, it is.
And I will put my dwelling place in your midst. What's God's dwelling place in the Old Testament?
The tabernacle.
He lived in the temple. That's where he was, right? If you wanted to go see Yahweh of Israel, where did you go meet him?
Temple.
Yeah. So this is Leviticus, remember. This is, you're sitting at Sinai at the mountain going, wonder what's going to happen in the future. And then it's like, hey, we made it. David, Solomon, we got a temple built. We've got the Ark of the Covenant in there. We got the priesthood. Everything's ready. God dwells among us. He is in the midst of us. Isn't that David's big lament? He didn't like that the ark was floating around. I need a house for God. And he just couldn't do it. He had to pass it on to his kid to build it. But isn't that what happened?
Yeah.
So you can make the argument that happened in the Old Testament. God dwelled in the midst of his people. Is that fair to say? And now we went through Ezekiel here. It's been months ago. And that was like the opposite of this story, right? The devastation of what happened when they turned to other gods. And you remember the big vision that Ezekiel has? What does he get to watch happen at the temple? Do you remember? God gets up, he goes to the threshold, and then he leaves and goes and stands on the mountain away. And how significant was that? What does that mean for the nation of Israel? God no longer is dwelling in our midst. He's left. Now, he's not saying he's gone for good, but he left and he's over there now. He's not in his dwelling place in our midst anymore. Okay, now why am I showing you this? We know when God was dwelling in the midst of the Israelites because we have all the Old Testament stuff with the temple, the tabernacle, and so on. In fact, when they rebuilt it, when they came back under Nehemiah, they rebuilt it, and then they had a big service. A cloud of smoke fills the tabernacle, and God's back. There's no temple now, is there? They don't have a temple in Israel. Why not? They got destroyed in 70 AD. That was a lot of years ago. A couple thousand almost. Why has it not been rebuilt? That's a question for another day. Now look at this. Paul's writing to the Corinthian church and he says, what agreement does Christ have with Belial, or the devil basically? Or what does a believer have with an unbeliever? What share do they have? Or what agreement does the temple of God have with idols?
None.
Right? He's contrasting these two opposites. For we are the temple of the living God. And then he says this, just as God said, I will live in them and will walk about among them, and I will be their God, and they will be my people. Okay, Paul, you're a theologian of Old Testament caliber. But when Paul reads what we just read in the Old Testament, what is he thinking about?
Future.
But where is the temple of God? You're it. Is because when you see this type of an Old Testament theologian like Paul take a verse from Leviticus that was about the land and God dwelling and keeping the contract and all this stuff, and he says, oh, by the way, you believers in Christ are where God dwells now. And then he quotes Leviticus. Has he foregone the Old Testament contracts?
Yeah, because Christ is the new contract, right?
Christ is the new contract.
Right.
So how does it play into this? How does Paul understand Leviticus when he writes to us? Like that we need a house built of stone and rocks where God can dwell and sit, and if you want to see him, you go there? Where would that be? Why do we need it? Do we need it? In some end times views, they'll say, absolutely you need it. My question is, regardless of the systems, regardless of all the views people like, what does Paul say about the temple? We're going to look at, I say teaser for next week, because we're going to try to get into Paul's head a little bit next week. And we're going to say, Paul, how do you understand these contracts? I mean, you are a Jew of Jews, tribe of Benjamin. You went to the best schools. What's your take on the contracts? Are they still in effect or not? Because it's going to impact what we think about Israel. It may not impact what we say when we vote, like, hey, we should support our closest ally in the Middle East, right, because of the things that are happening. It may not have any impact on that. I honestly don't think it really should. But I do think it's important to know, biblically, what's the significance of Israel. And then we can talk about the place in the world and our ally and support and those things. But what is it that we need to know about their current state from God's perspective? The key that we're going to ask probably in the next week is, what do you mean offspring of Abraham? Okay, I want you to think about that question this week. What does it mean to be the offspring of Abraham? What do you share in? Okay, just think about that. I'm not going to give the answer. We're going to talk about it in a coming week.